Governor Jerry Brown has presented his final budget plan to the legislature. What are his priorities in his last year as governor? Building more reserves? Spending more money on schools and community colleges? Are there any new infrastructure proposals? We'll find out from the state's acknowledged budget expert, Mac Taylor, California's legislative analyst, and then we'll get political analysis from John Myers of the LA Times and Dan Walters of CALmatters. Governor Brown's last budget. Caution despite surplus.
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. Chevron's Coalinga oil field and Fresno County have been doing side by side for over 100 years. Learn more at doers.com. From the California channel at the state capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. The governor's presented his 2018-19 budget proposal to the legislature. What are the governor's priorities, and will the state's revenues be sufficient to cover the state's short and long-term expenses? Our guest is Mac Taylor, California's legislative analyst and the authoritative voice on the budget, a nonpartisan voice on the state budget. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you, Mark.
So let's talk about the general condition of the general fund. State's tax receipts, are they above or below expectations?
Well, they've been doing very well. In fact, we had a sort of a gangbuster December, but part of that could have been due to the Federal Tax Act, which encouraged certain people to make decisions about moving expenditures of their state tax payments into December. But overall, revenues have been running above what we had assumed, and so far we're doing very well.
Do you expect any changes in May after the annual tax receipts are counted?
Yeah, once we get through with people making their final payments by April 15th, we'll know a lot more. And yeah, we're pretty optimistic. We think there's probably a lot of upside to the governor's revenue requests, so the legislature could find itself with more money than what the governor has suggested in January.
When I was reading your report, it indicates that a lot of this growth is with personal income tax. If my math is right, and you might correct me, $4.2 billion of this of the $5.8 billion increase is attributable to the personal income tax. That's 72%, almost 3/4. People don't realize sometimes that's where a lot of that money is coming from, is the personal income tax.
Well, and the personal income tax funds about 70% of all of the general funds, so we're heavily dependent on that.
Right, right, and that's another conversation,
Yeah.
But let's go on. So the economic effects with this new federal tax change on the U.S. economy in the short run, what are your expectations?
Well, I think most economic forecasters expect there to be a little bit of a boost to the economy, and that can come either from consumers having more money because of the tax cuts, or the businesses now with their corporate tax reductions and various other provisions. I think the hope is that they'll invest a lot more, which will help trigger additional growth in the economy.
So someone say that's a sugar high, but will it continue on beyond this year? Question mark.
And I think that's the question of what are the possible downsides for the longer run.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, such as, is it going to help feed inflation? You've got a very tight labor markets, and will that sort of drive inflation as opposed to real increases? Higher interest rates, and of course you contributed to the federal debt, which also can
Which is kind of counterintuitive then, right? You're doing it to heat up the economy in a way, but then it results in higher interest rates, which means it'll maybe slow down the economy.
It could dampen it. So you have to look at the net effect. And I think over the long run, you really want to look at, is it going to help business investment that makes us more productive?
Right. Okay. Let's focus on the implications for the federal tax cuts on California specifically. In a lot of talk about this state and local taxes and the cap on that, and mortgage interest deductions. It doesn't sound good for California because we have higher taxes here and higher home prices.
Yes, there are provisions on the personal income tax side at the federal level where Californians will probably do worse than other states, and that's just the things that you mentioned, because we do have high state taxes and we do have high property taxes, not so much from our rate, which is actually quite low because of Proposition 13, but because our values are so high.
Right, right.
And so there will be probably a lot more Californians affected by those deductions. But you have to counter that with a lot of high-income Californians will benefit from some of the corporate and business provisions.
Yeah, I'm sure they're all looking at their tax rates and figuring out how this is all going to work out. But have they thought about that for the state budget? Is that federal tax change reflected in the governor's proposal?
No, they had to put together their budget really before the final action on the federal tax plan. So when we get to the May revision, which occurs in the middle of...
Often referred to as the May revise, which apparently is grammatically incorrect.
It's the May revision, technically.
Okay.
But we know all the information, or a lot more information about income tax payments, about how many estimated payments well-to-do taxpayers are making. So we have a much better sense of revenues at that time.
So we've been talking about revenues. What about state spending? Higher or lower, and by how much?
The spending has been a little bit higher on certain areas, like healthcare spending on the poor has gone up a little bit. We had higher costs because of all the fires.
I was reading a report, $760 million.
Yeah,
wow.
So that's a hit. We recently had some good news, though, because of action that the federal government recently took. We should have some good savings on what's called the CHIP program, which is health care for kids who don't quite, their families make a little bit too much income to qualify for Medicaid.
And there was a concern that if that didn't happen, then it would really hit California.
And they actually kept a much higher federal share, and so we're actually going to have some savings from what the governor assumed in his January budget.
Yeah, but when you think about the fires, $750 million.
That was a lot of money.
Wow.
Now, we may get reimbursed for that, but that occurs over time.
Don't count the money until it comes in, right? I know that's your
That's one perspective.
Okay. Well, up next, we're going to talk about some of these constitutional set-asides for education and rainy day funds. What implications do they have for the state budget? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with the state's nonpartisan budget expert, Mac Taylor, with the Legislative Analyst Office. He is the state legislative analyst about the governor's proposed budget. You know, there are two constitutional spending formulas. One is Prop 98, which has a minimum state funding for schools, and then there's also Prop 2, which has spending on debt payment in the rainy day fund. So how much total money needs to be set aside to meet those financial obligations?
Well, on schools, you have an overall guarantee, this sort of minimum amount, and it's composed of both property taxes and the general fund, the state general fund. The state general fund, the governor estimates, will need to spend about $55 billion for schools, K-14 through community colleges.
And that's the biggest part of the state budget,
Absolutely.
right, is education. Okay.
About 40%. And that's a fairly substantial increase over the current year, so schools are getting growth in that, that minimum amount. Then as far as Proposition 2 is concerned, it requires the state to set aside monies based on both overall general fund revenues and how much excess capital gains we have. And then you determine this pot of money, and half of it has to go to our rainy day fund. Half of it has to go to pay off past debts.
Right.
And so the governor is estimating that those Proposition 2 requirements are about $3 billion, half to each.
Okay, let's talk about Prop 98, the education formula. What are the major components of the governor's Prop 98 spending plan this year? Well,
I think it's helpful to split it up into K-12 versus community colleges.
Right.
On the K-12 schools part...
I don't want to say K-14 because nobody knows what I'm talking about when I say that, right? So
it's sort of our shorthand, but so elementary and secondary schools through high schools. Most of the money that the governor's proposing is similar to what the legislature has approved in recent years. It would go to fully fund what's called the local control funding formula, which is just the way that we send monies down to schools, and they have a lot of control over how they spend it.
It's a little bump, isn't it, on school districts that have lower income students and those kinds of things, so they can help focus resources there.
In this formula, they get more money for that. So a lot of it is the governor's proposing to fully fund the targets we set about 5 years ago. So we're ahead of time in meeting those targets. And then they also proposes a big one-time sort of grant where districts could spend the money on what they wanted, maintenance or other one-time things.
Yeah, but the amount of money that they're spending per student, according to your report, is $11,628 in this budget. That's a lot of money per student.
And it's been going up steadily.
Yeah, it's a big difference from what it was when he first started as governor.
Yes.
A huge difference. What else here? So let's talk about your analysis of this split between ongoing augmentations and one-time initiatives. You're calling that his approach when it comes to Prop 98 is reasonable, quote unquote. That's your term. Why do you think so?
Well, just think about school spending. If we should have a recession, if you commit all of the spending within the guarantee to ongoing programs, what do you have to do when the money turns down and you have to cut 98? You have to go into your base programs and make reductions. If you have a chunk that's for one time, that drops out, and you can support that lower level of ongoing spending without making substantial cuts to it. So it's more like it's not a reserve exactly, but it's a way to sort of help school districts make sure that they don't face the sort of abrupt reductions that we had in the last recession.
The other thing I saw was kind of interesting is that they're talking about changing the community college funding formula. which is kind of interesting. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, it's a very important proposal, and I think the legislature is going to have to spend a lot of time on that. We basically give out most of the money now to community colleges, as we do to schools, just on how many people are there. Seat time,
right.
People that come through the door. And the governor's proposing that, one, we give a substantial chunk of money based on the number of low-income or English learners, similar to what we do in K-12. And then he's also saying we should set aside about a quarter of the monies on performance. That is, if you are getting a lot of kids out with certificates and degrees, they should be rewarded and have more money than those that aren't doing well.
I don't know if I've got this right, but it sounds like community college used to be treated more like UC and CSU, and now they're being treated, proposal is they're being treated more like K-12. Is that right, or is that?
Well, except on K-12, we give it all out on basically the formulas of the type of kids you have. There's not really a performance aspect that he's suggesting.
But the local control funding formula, kind of part of that.
That part of it is you could view as being analogous.
Okay. We've got the other one we got is Prop 2, the other constitutional spending formula, rainy day fund. Any comments about that?
Well, the governor is proposing to have total reserves of about 12% of our general fund budget. And that's the most we've had in almost forever. It is a lot. We do have a very volatile revenue structure as we keep getting back to it. And when you have that kind of system, you need to have large reserves.
Yeah. So the governor's budget also proposes some money for various legislative initiatives and agreements. Can you give just a few quick examples? Yeah,
these are basically sort of arrangements that he had with the legislature to follow through in future years.
I promise to pay you, here's an IOU, and he's actually paying them.
It's sort of, this is the way we're going to interpret certain laws, or this is what I'm going to follow through the third year of a 3-year deal. And an example of that is on child care, where a couple of years ago we said we're going to increase some rates and add some slots. We're just going to do it over time, and the governor is following through on that arrangement.
Okay, so how does the governor's plan to spend the state's discretionary dollars? How's that going to happen? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. So where does the governor want to spend those state discretionary dollars, those that exist? We're talking to the state's authoritative voice on the budget, Mac Taylor, the state's legislative analyst. So it's clear that the governor's priority in his proposed budget is growing reserves, including diverting more than is minimally required under Prop 2. How much more?
A lot. Okay. He had almost $7 billion in what we call discretionary monies after you pay for the constitutional things we talked about.
Right.
He puts almost half of that just in additional payments into the rainy day reserve, $3.5 billion. And what that would do is max out the amount that is required or allowed in effect under Proposition 2 at 10% of total general fund revenues.
It's more than actually 10, right? It actually goes up as high as 12%.
Well, the 12% is because there's another discretionary reserve that's our second rainy day, or our other discretionary reserve. But he maxes out what's called the basic rainy day fund that was established under Prop 2 at 10%, which is sort of the goal that was set in that measure.
Yeah, so any money set aside for a rainy day fund means you're not spending that money for public goods and services, right? So you've made that decision. Is the governor's continued focus on reserves, is that prudent?
Well, we think so. And again, it's because of what can happen in a downturn, how quickly our fiscal situation can change, because personal income tax revenues, which again are about 70% of our overall revenues, they can head south pretty fast.
They're very volatile.
Very low. They're very volatile. So it's sort of what level of reserve do you want to have? And what I've told the members is I think you should have at least that 10% in the rainy day, if not more.
Okay, so that begs the question, what is the optimal level of reserves?
There is no optimal level. You have to think about, well, what kind of recession do you want to plan for? When do you think it's coming? If it's coming tomorrow, you might want to even add more money. If you think it's coming maybe now 3 or 4 years down the road, you might think of where that 12% in total that we have now is reasonable. So it sort of depends upon a lot of factors that legislators have to sort of weigh and balance.
And it's the tax system, personal income taxes in California is kind of skewed to the wealthier people are paying.
Very skewed.
And so capital gains is a big deal. And so I remember reading somewhere, you probably know better than I, but I'm sure you would, that sale of certain stocks go down can have a dramatic effect on what the state is going to get in terms of revenue.
Absolutely. Capital gains are probably the single most volatile source, but we have others too. Business income, stock options, bonuses, things like that are related to a good economy, those can also really go down.
So it's interesting, when the economy is going down, you're losing revenue and expenses would seem to be going up.
Some.
Potentially.
Yes, absolutely, some expenses.
Yeah, that could be problematic. So let's talk a little bit about public goods and services that the governor actually would like to spend some money on. What's he proposing in terms of infrastructure and equipment?
Well, after he spends a lot, or he dedicates a lot of this discretionary money I talked about to building reserves, his next priority seems to be to spend some one-time money which is also fairly cautious, right? You're not committing to ongoing spending.
Right.
And he spends it on infrastructure, capital outlay projects. So there's lots of new money.
Concrete.
Well, there's a lot of that. For example, he budgets the projects based on the new revenues coming in from the gas taxes that increased recently.
I wouldn't say about the political aspects of that. If the voters are going to be voting on something in November, seeing signs up that construction's happening on roads might not be a bad idea.
That's true. And then he's also assuming that a bond on natural resources that will be in front of the voters in June passes, and so he budgets some monies from that.
I want to get into the weeds a little bit. Maybe you'll appreciate this. I was looking at what he's spending money on. One is $134 million on voting systems. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Good idea. The counties need this. It seems like a lot of their equipment is antiquated.
Yeah, I think that was our view, that you probably could wisely spend this on updating equipment throughout the state, especially as we move to changes in the way that we do their so-called voting centers.
The voting centers, which is a big change.
And so we thought the governor paying attention to that was a good idea, regardless of whether 134 is the exact amount or not.
Right. The other one I saw, this is really getting into the weeds, is $12 million for emergency communications. And I had read a study somewhere about the emergency warning system for earthquakes was about that much for California. So it looks like he's thinking about putting some money aside for some of these projects.
Well, and he puts aside money to just repair roofs on our prisons that are leaking.
Right.
And if you don't catch that, obviously you can have much more damage done in the future.
Anybody who has a home,
oh boy,
knows
you know that.
Right. So one last quick question: any other thoughts on the governor's key budget proposals?
Sure. I think after you think, if you think about this discretionary money, first reserves, then some one-time spending primarily on infrastructure. He did have some ongoing increases. For example, he puts almost $200 million in the courts, the operations of the courts, which did get some rather steep reductions during the recession.
They've been asking money for a while.
And they've been asking that. And he extends some of his business tax credits, and he provides money for the universities. Not very much, 3% increase.
3%. He says that's enough.
And so there are some other ongoing increases.
Okay, well, up next, I want to thank Mac Taylor for that conversation. Up next, we're going to talk about the politics of the budget with Dan Walters of CALmatters and John Myers of the LA Times. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're now joined by two well-respected observers of state politics, Dan Walters with CALmatters and John Myers with the LA Times. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thanks.
So, gentlemen, I'll start with you, John, first. What are your thoughts on the governor's prioritizing reserves in this budget he's proposed?
Absolutely unsurprising. How's that for a headline? I mean, this has been the Jerry Brown playbook since he came back into office in 2011, which is try to restrain, in some ways, and I want to be careful there because he has spent more money, the state has spent more money every year, but restrain the growth in spending, try to find ways to put money aside for the eventual recession. That's why he had voters pass Prop 2 in 2014 that expanded the size of that rainy day fund. And so no, not surprising at all that the governor would say, let's shove more of the current windfall, the projected windfall rather, into the reserve fund.
So is it prudent or just overly risk averse?
Prudent and overly risk-averse.
So
Sounds like a Jerry Brownism if I ever heard one. I'd say it's prudent because it's still risky. The rainy day fund maxes out about $13.5 billion. And he's, by his own arithmetic, a mild recession would cost him $60 billion over 3 years. So the rainy
Which
day
is what
fund,
was happening before, right? We were having $20 billion deficits during the Great Recession.
yeah, about a 20% decline, give or take. And so even with all the money he wants to put aside, the state could still be in a big, deep doo-doo should we get a recession. Now, I think the more interesting thing is the rainy day fund will hit its max this next year.
Which is 10%.
10%. And also school funding hits a max, which means that if the state gets extra money in the kitty, as the alleged analyst, as your guest has probably told you they would, then that money becomes kind of unrestricted. In other words, it doesn't have to go to schools. It doesn't have to go into reserves. So it makes it a more difficult thing for Jerry Brown to divert that into reserves because he's got all these Democratic legislators wanting to spend it on child care and welfare grants and all sorts of new maybe even health care for undocumented immigrants. Lots of plans kicking around that would cost billions of dollars of new entitlements that would be difficult to reduce if you do get a recession. And so will Jerry Brown stand up to that heat or will he cave in?
Yeah, a little bit like a feeding frenzy, it sounds like. So let me ask you this. Talking about education, he's fully funded the local control funding formula 2 years ahead of schedule. So can you say mission accomplished?
No, because we don't know whether it works or not. And there's very strong indications that it doesn't work. It hasn't made any demonstrable improvement in the academic performance of the kids it's supposed to help, i.e. poor kids and English learners. So, you know, money by itself doesn't do anything if it doesn't actually do the job, and we don't know that it's done the job. We may not know for years whether it's done the job.
And that's assuming it stays on the books, that another governor doesn't come and rethink the way that we fund schools, because that, I think, is a real fear of some education advocates, even if they don't love the formula, that the next governor may not be committed to that kind of idea.
What about community colleges and the money he's setting aside? Good idea, bad idea?
Well, I mean, certainly he's following through what the legislature did last year, which was this first year of community colleges essentially free. He's found the money in the budget for it. Again, there's a surplus of money there. Governor has talked a lot about the changing face of higher education. I don't know exactly how that's going to shake out once you talk about it. He's talked about online ideas beyond the community college. But clearly there's a lot of support for that, and it's really not that expensive in context of the rest of the budget. I think it's probably going to happen easily.
Okay, let's talk about higher education, CSU and UC. 3%, he's saying that's enough. They're saying we want a tuition increase.
Well, they're saying, yeah, and it's the usual kabuki dance, as Arnold Schwarzenegger liked to call it, where the colleges threaten a tuition increase if they don't get more money from Sacramento, and they go sturm and drang, and all sorts of horrible things are going to happen, and then the legislature and the governor have to decide whether they want to cave into that and give them some more money so they won't have a tuition increase, and it goes on every year, and this is it's more of the same, so to speak. But I think underlying that is, in both the community colleges and the four-year schools, is California isn't producing enough college graduates, and so whether it's
like a million short a year or something?
Yeah, it's a combination of things. It's a combination of demography. In other words, baby boomers retiring out of the labor force, plus the changing nature of the economy requiring more education. And so we're falling short on college graduates in California. And then a not inconsiderable factor is that if you get your degree in California, can you find a place to live? And so sometimes kids want to take their graduates, whether they're kids or not, want to take their degrees to Texas or someplace else where they can afford to live.
We spend the money educating them, and then they leave.
That's right.
John, I want to ask you, so Dan was talking about we may have more money coming in. Analyst also said the same thing. You think it's going to be a food fight over, spending that on new programs?
I don't know. I mean, if you look at the conventional wisdom in the past, you would say yes, there's going to be pretty intense debates about some of this. I think you see leaders of the legislature, Democrats, who have said that the governor's budget is only that, it's an opening offer, and that they want to negotiate more. They don't think that some of the social services programs have ever come back fully where they need to be. They've talked about child care. They've talked about the expansion, I should say, of the earned income tax credit for California, which has had a lot of success by some of the data there. I think there is going to be an interesting discussion, but I will say that all the volatility we've been seeing recently on Wall Street and stocks, those are the people who those capital gains, that's where the money comes from in California. So I think it should be cautious about how much of it you spend in the early part of 2018.
Being prudent. I want to thank John Mars of the LA Times and Dan Walters from CalMatters, as well as Mac Taylor from the California Legislative Analyst Office for joining us. If you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or log on to our website to get the Maddy Daily at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.